Vera looked over her glasses at the 11 women facing her at the long table. As usual, she was chairing the meeting, being the most senior member. Thank you, Helga, for the treasurer's report. The balance looks very healthy. It's good to know we have a healthy cash reserve to carry out our policies. So, for the next business, that brings me to a pleasant task. I welcome our new member Katya, who is replacing Caroline. Please stand up, Katya. Katya was in her 30s, with dark brown hair cut to a practical length, just above the collar of her striped business suit. Just slightly embarrassed with the attention, she stood up and gave a modest wave to the others. Katya brings some legal experience to our committee, said Vera. She's a civil lawyer and we welcome her particular expertise. Thank you, Katya. Vera shuffled her papers. So, under old business, she sat back in her chair and looked at the others. As you know, we like to have some follow-up to our actions to review the results. You were all sent summaries of these a week or so ago and, having looked at them, I think that we're doing an excellent job. As you know, a founding principle of our organization is to improve situations where women work under men in threatening, demeaning or other circumstances, by removing the men. As you know, we do this by making the men into women. Our little book of magic has shown itself very effective and the magic doesn't appear to be running out. The men suffer much initial mental trauma, of course, finding themselves in women's bodies. After all, it is a drastic realignment of all aspects of their lives, but we hope it changes their attitudes. She gave a faint smile. They become beautiful women so eventually they could attract male attention, whether welcomed or not. Perhaps it would have been better if they were more average in appearance, but that can't be helped. She laid her glasses on the table. I was wondering, Katya, if you had any problem with the actions of this committee? Katya shook her head. Vera, members of the committee, it could be argued that what this committee does is at least a type of assault, but personally, I have no trouble with any action that removes a society ill. So, you will hear no objection from me. She smiled and shook her head in wonder. Although, in this day and age, the thought of a book of magic takes some getting used to. Thank you, Katya. So, to return to what I was saying, we needn't be too concerned with that our subjects adjusting or not. If they do adjust satisfactorily, they could become a credit to women. At the very least, they will find they have a lot in common with most women. If they don't adjust, too bad. Then the change can be a punishment for past attitudes and they are at least removed from a position of being able to use undesirable actions. However, there was one case just a few months ago, which has not gone quite to plan. Amanda, I believe you were involved with this. Can you give us an update on it? Amanda was in her mid-20s. She was about average height, a pretty woman with a slim, graceful figure. Her luxuriant red hair was gathered above her head by an ornate comb, but, as usual, a few curling wayward strands had escaped and hung down her pale neck. She cleared her throat. I had the task of, removing a man called Mason McQuillan from his position as supervisor of an office in the city government. Our information about him had come from Caroline White, who, as you know, she pressed her lips together in disapproval, was a former member of our committee. So, I got into a position where I could read Mason our spell and change him to a woman. That went according to plan and she, the new woman, was left in her apartment naked and with only women's clothes available. However, unknown to us, it turned out that Caroline was Mason's ex-wife. Desperate for help, I suppose, our subject contacted Caroline. We have since found out that Caroline made her a job offer. As a result, Mason has become a woman called Maria and is now a domestic employee of Caroline's. She is a live-in maid. And treated as a rather low-level one. Yes, can I interrupt here, Amanda? Vera asked. It's the policy of our group that our talents and policies should be used for judgments and punishments, but not for personal reasons. We do not want to lose our objectivity or appear vindictive. Because that may have been Caroline's motivation, we have required her to resign from our group. At least Mason was removed from his position, although it also appears that our actions preempted those of the women in his office who were compiling a large file on his attitudes and actions. They intended to present that list to Mason's superiors to both remove him and get further leverage. Unfortunate, but it cannot be helped. So that brings me to the next item on our agenda, further actions. Rose, you chair our subcommittee which investigates new candidates. Can you tell us about them? Rose was a pretty, dark-haired young woman, one of the founder members of the group. She was petite, almost tiny, but her intensity equaled that of any in the committee. She peered at a list in front of her. My committee has looked at several cases. These include a churchman, 2 businessmen, and several politicians. She sighed. In fact, there are potentially all too many of them, but it's not, say, as if we could change any high-ranking individual. That would spark police and other investigations that might uncover our role, and we cannot have that. The existence of our magic book must be kept secret by all means. That was the condition that the woman we got the book from demanded. So, what we have settled on is a medical scientist, called Robert Kreutzmark. He has both MD and PhD qualifications and owns, a medical research laboratory on the outskirts of the city. He came to our attention because not only of boorish and sexist behavior, but because he has routinely, almost invariably, downplayed the role of female researchers in his laboratory. For instance, he routinely fails to include their names as major contributors in publications in research journals or downplays their roles. This is demeaning, callous, and insulting, but also it seriously affects their further job prospects. Some are afraid to leave his laboratory in case of poor recommendations. They are caught in a kind of trap. Vera looked round the table. I can see by your faces that this would be a good subject. So, Rose, do you propose that he should be our next target? I do. Any discussion on this? Vera looked round. Sue, you have a question? Sue was an office manager, about 30, of average height with striking features and lively eyes. Her straight brown hair was cut in a practical bob style. Yes, what age is this man? And it sounds as if he could have quite a high profile, at least in a certain group, I mean scientists. Rose looked at her notes. He's now in his late 20s. Actually, he's quite brilliant, started university at age 16 and got both his doctorate degrees by 24. He even published as an undergraduate. He's energetic, a bit of a workaholic too, and he's garnered big research grants and contracts. Yes, he's fairly high profile, but frankly, most contemporaries intensely dislike him for his manner. You see, it's all about promoting himself and pushing his own interests. He's also shown he's vindictive and critical to competitors or anyone that he thinks crosses him or even might cross him. Worse, simply on this basis, he's been known to reject competitors' scientific papers that have been sent for him to review. He's got a second-in-command who does the day-to-day running of the laboratory called Stephen Lund. Stephen is a different man from his boss, well thought of, and also has an excellent scientific reputation, so he could take over running the lab. Actually, I'm surprised he's stayed with Kreutzmark. I'm told that the lab does important and high-quality research work, so it would be a pity for it to break apart. All Kreutzmark needs to do is to disappear or be removed. Vera saw Sue give a nod of approval. All right. We'll vote on it. So, all those in favor? I see, carried unanimously. She looked round. Then, the next questions are, how do we get to him, and who will do it? Does anyone have any suggestions? Amanda, are you interested? Amanda shook her head. He may be more difficult than the ones we discussed. With Henry Sisson, I approached him at his work, Mason McQuillan at his work too. I got a job there and that allowed me to get close to him. For this man, I certainly don't have any scientific training and he would be surrounded by too many employees. It can't be done at his workplace. Helga held up her hand. I'm no scientist either, but if he's like you describe, he'll be keen to show his own importance and push his own agenda. I used to work in a book publisher's office and I know the language and procedures. I think, with just a little advice from a friend who's still in the business, I could pass myself off as a publisher's representative who wants him to write a book. That would appeal to his vanity, and no doubt he'd see it as a way to play up his own contributions. All I'd need is to get him alone for an hour and preferably away from his laboratory. I think I can see a way to do that, but I may need some help from the rest of the committee. I'll let you know. All right, Helga, why don't we leave it with you? A week or two later, Robert Kreutzmark had just come into his office. It was set in a corner of the main lab so he could watch over his workers better. It was mid-morning, but it had been late the previous evening when he had left. He noted that all of his researchers were already at their benches, at cabinets, or at their desks working on computers. He glanced down on his desk. 2 separate groups in his lab had drafts of papers to be checked. That could be done in the evening. He checked the other stuff. There was some of the usual correspondence and some from scientific suppliers advertising equipment. Then one caught his eye. At the bottom of the pile was a business-type letter addressed to him. He recognized the name on the envelope, one of the biggest name scientific publishers. He opened that first, his eyes widening and a smile broadening on his face when he read it. He was interrupted by his deputy, Steve Lund. "Got a minute, boss?" the big man said. "Yes," Robert said, but his attention was still on the letter. He was elated. At last his work was going to be really recognized. "Well, you look like the cat that got the canary." "What's that?" Steve asked. "It's an invitation to write a book, a review article, right on our area of research. It asks if a publisher's representative could come and see me in a couple of days. I'll confirm it by email." "Oh, good for you." "Yeah, thanks. And it should be straightforward to write it." He was already thinking of the arrangement of the chapters. He could have some of the women in the lab write them up and then edit them, placing only his name on the final drafts. It was a great opportunity to also push his own research, and he could give only passing mention to those annoying competing groups in Oxford and Zurich, anything to downplay their work. Maybe he could introduce some red herrings too. "I'll get some of the assistants to rough it out. Anyway, what was it you wanted?" "It's just that we've had good preliminary results with that new gene splicing method. So we should move on to a more detailed test." "Good. I'll discuss it with you this afternoon. Get that team together and we'll meet in the conference room." 2 days later, Robert looked up as a young woman appeared at the door of the lab, accompanied by his receptionist. "Someone to see you, Dr. Klein. The Miss Helga Westergaard you were expecting." Helga put out her hand to him as she was ushered in. "It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Kreutzmark. I've heard so much about you and your important work." He looked at the woman with approval as he took her hand. She appeared to be in her mid-20s. She was moderately tall, with a straight, slim figure. Her blonde hair was tied severely back with a black ribbon. Her skin was very fair and her eyes were a pale penetrating blue to match her stylish blue pantsuit. He detected a slight accent. "So what's the little bit of accent I hear?" He gave his question just a touch of condescension. She flashed him a smile. "It shows, does it? I'm from Denmark, Copenhagen actually. Anyhow, Dr. Kreutzmark, you got our letter. As it said, my company is aware of your growing reputation and wants you to write a review for us." Helga went on to outline the conditions, what he would be paid, and how further royalties would be handled. Katya had been handy at drawing these up. She pulled out a file from her case and handed it to him. "This will expand on what I've just said. I'm sure you want to go over these." But Robert was only paying half attention. The woman was very attractive and these details could be gone over later. "It sounds good," he said, "but, yes, I'll need some days to check it." "Yes, I understand. But, if can be as bold, your lab, from what I hear, does cutting-edge research. We're keen to get this review going as soon as possible. I tell you, if you want, I can arrange for you to meet with some of our editorial staff and they can fill you in on any questions. We have a new office here in town. I'll arrange a meeting there." She gave him a card with an address and even a small map. Would this be suitable? Could we meet there, say, 2 p.m. on Friday? Robert was impressed as he drew up to the address in his Porsche. It was a newish building in one of the small technological developments on the outskirts of the city. They must have just moved in, he thought. The unit in the small complex appeared to be one of only 2 that had been leased, but prominently displayed over the door was an elaborate sign with the name and the logo of the publisher. Next door, it looked like some small catering business was in the process of setting up. The parking lot was empty, but a small truck with sheet metal firm's name on it sat in a lot directly opposite. He pushed in the door and was immediately accosted by Helga. "Ah, Dr. Kreutzmark, so good of you to come," she said, giving him a professional smile. Another half-dozen or so women were busy working at desks behind her. He was impressed. All of the desks looked very tidy, all with neatly piled papers. 1 or 2 of the staff were peering into computers. Some fresh posters about the company and its recent publications were stuck on the walls. "You're new in these premises?" he commented. "Yes, just getting into it. A lot of make-do furniture, but we have all we need. However, I'm sure you are a busy man, so I'll get right to business," said Helga. "Come through here to the back to our conference room and I'll introduce you to our people." "Oh, would you like some coffee?" "Sure, black." "Katya," asked Helga, "can you pour us 4 coffees, please?" "Anyway, through here," she said. She led him into what looked like a boardroom. It was quite bare too, just a few posters about the company's productions, and a big table surrounded by chairs. All looked brand new. "Dr. Kreutzmark, I'd like you to meet Vera Campbell. She's senior here. And this is Amanda Hughes, second in command, and Rose O'Hara. She's senior editor. Ah, here's our coffee." She smiled. "I see you're the only one who takes it black. You know, Dr. Kreutzmark, I wasn't aware of how big the lab that you run actually was. How many employees have you?" Robert took big a gulp of the coffee. "Well, ladies, it's nice to meet you all. My lab has roughly 24 people in it, mostly scientists and technicians, but there's support staff too." He made a show of looking at his watch. "However, can we get down to business? I have important research to supervise." He needed to show them how important he was. "But anyway, let me say that I welcome the or ton it y to con bout our disc. He could not finish. His tongue seemed to have a mind of its own and the room had started to spin about him. He tried to rise but his limbs would not obey him. It was all he could do to keep in the chair. Helga slapped his face gently but he could not react. "Robert, can you hear me?" "Ugh," was all he said. She straightened up. Things appeared to be going to plan. "Help me." The 4 women eased Robert from his chair and laid him on the floor. Amanda hurried out to the other room. "All right, gang, it's started," she cried. "Get the place cleared now." Immediately the other women bundled up their papers and closed their laptops, folded the desks and chairs and started lifting them through a door at the back and loading them into a van. "Don't forget the company name and insignia we've got stuck on the front either." She pointed to them. When Amanda returned to the room, the other 3 had finished cutting Robert's clothes from him. They bundled the tatters into a bag. His head lolled and his eyes were unfocused. "He's ready," Vera said. "Better get on with it." She reached into her purse and pulled out the little book. "Robert? Robert Kreutzmark." She shook him gently but he just grunted. "Maybe you realize we've drugged you. Our organization has looked at your behavior and attitudes. We've decided that while you may be a brilliant scientist, you've taken advantage of too many people, women especially, and the women researchers in your employment most of all. You've routinely downplayed their contributions, you've insulted them, and a lot more. So, we are going to punish you and in a way that's appropriate. We're going to change you to a woman. We've got a magic spell that will do it. Maybe that way you'll get an appreciation of what your actions have done to women. Your identity will be gone." Robert, even in his befogged mind, thought the woman was delusional. Magic? Just one thing before we start, said Amanda. He's pretty hairy. I know he'll lose the male pattern hair soon after he wakes up, but... I'd thought of that, said Helga. I have a razor here, and cream for his face, and here, she opened a carrier bag. And, I have this pot with wax, and some cloth strips. Use that on his body. I'll plug it in and it'll be just a minute. Amanda held out her hand. Let me do it. She giggled. A full Brazilian coming up. She lathered Robert and carefully shaved his face. Robert was wide-eyed, but he could do nothing. When she started with waxed cloths and ripped them away, Robert went wide-eyed and jerked a little as the strips were torn off, but all he managed was a grunt or two. That's it, said Amanda, straightening up. Sorry, it took longer than I expected. You'd better get started, Helga. Helga gently folded back the page on the book and began to read. It only took her a minute or so. Robert could barely focus, but he saw his clothes being put into a bag. Vera pulled out stuff from another bag. She held up one garment. Look at this, Robert. We're leaving you a dress. It's quite pretty, isn't it, with the flowers? There's some pantyhose and a bra too, and shoes with it, women's stuff. We're going to leave you here. You're not leaving her any panties? Asked Amanda. No, but there's a pair of pantyhose. That's so that when she wakes up and wants to cover her new equipment, she'll have to slide pantyhose up her legs too. Helga placed the little book in a bag and put that in her purse. She leaned over Robert. You'll soon fall unconscious and you'll be out for a day or so, but you'll be a woman when you wake. First though, you're going to get violent shivering. You feeling cold yet? Amanda felt the semi-conscious figure's brow. No sign yet. Robert was still dazed, but he suddenly felt shivery. I think I just saw it start, said Helga. A few seconds later another shiver followed, then he began shivering continuously. In a few more minutes his teeth were chattering violently and his naked skin began to ripple as the changes started. Amanda forced a cloth between his clenched teeth as his eyes closed and he fell unconscious. It's working, breathed Amanda. I'm always amazed at what happens. They watched as the spell started its work until the body looked as if it was blurred. That's it, said Helga after a half hour. She clapped her hands. We can leave him now. I'd like to see the final result, but it's time we got out of here. The other women came into the room and helped them clear all traces of their occupancy. With a last check they turned out the light, closed the door, piled into the van and drove away. Helga climbed into the Porsche. She would leave it with its keys in a crime-ridden part of the city. It was almost 2 days later when the woman lying on the floor began to stir. Her legs and arms began to jerk sporadically and she gave little groans at the deep ache in them. Later, she stretched, wincing at spasms of pain. She pushed to her knees awkwardly. She just felt nauseated, and her head was splitting. As her head cleared she became aware she was cold and she put her arms about her chest to try to warm herself, but she tensed as she detected something different. She unfolded her arms, looked at her chest and screamed. In her vision, on her own chest, were 2 female breasts, each tipped with prominent nipples and areolas. She pushed her legs open and gaped at her groin, screaming again. The penis and the soft pouch below were entirely gone. When she pushed her fingers further down she discovered the soft folds of a woman's pubis. She screamed with the shock for several minutes, and as her mind focused she remembered what some woman had said to her, something about being made into a woman. These women were punishing her? She scrambled to her feet and looked around. The room was completely bare except for a pair of pantyhose, a white sports bra, a dress and shoes, and a wallet. She recognized it as her own, but when she opened it all she found was money. All of her credit cards and identification were gone. She stumbled into the other room. It was bare too, except for a bottle of water. She opened the outside door then stopped. She was naked. She looked frantically around for something to cover herself with, but there were only the women's clothes. She sank onto the floor, overwhelmed. There was water, and she drank that, but there was no food. It took her another day before, shuddering, she pulled on the pantyhose, bra and dress, fumbling awkwardly with its rear zipper. The shoes fit her fairly well. She staggered out into the street. She needed to get help. Some weeks later the Women's Committee met again. "So, what's the result of our work on Robert Kreutzmark?" Vera asked. Amanda deferred to Helga. "We kept an eye on the unit from a bit of distance. It was actually 3 days before the new woman emerged. We watched her as she staggered out of the building and lurched down the road. She was actually wearing the dress and shoes we left for her. And pantyhose." "How did she look?" Katya asked. "A bit wild, her dress crumpled, a teary face, and her hair was a mess too." "She must have been pretty hungry," Katya commented. "Yes, that would drive her out. We left her only 1 bottle of water too, so she'd be thirsty." "What then?" Rose asked. "We didn't follow her directly, but we have contacts in the police, and we found out later that she had gone into a nearby office to get help, understandably. The people there could see that she was distraught, and eventually the police were called and later an ambulance. The police were totally skeptical of her story. No one at all believed her story, so she got more and more distraught. They dragged her off and put her in a psychiatric ward, but she seemed to settle down in a week and she was released. Then she tried to get to her apartment, but we had taken her keys and any ID, so the building supervisor there refused to let her in. The police then had another complaint. She had gone to her laboratory. I heard that she kicked up an awful fuss before their security pushed her out. The police had to be called there too, as she had become hysterical. She obviously had been trying to persuade them that she had been Robert Kreutzmark. Anyway, no one believed her. But I have to give her credit for determination. In fact, within a week after that she had arranged new identification and started calling on other medical laboratories in the city looking for work. Unfortunately for her, the word had got around that she was a crazy woman and no one would hire her. The latest we heard, she's working at a grocery checkout. However, she's bright and pushy, so we'd be better to keep tabs on her. "What about the laboratory?" Vera asked. "Oh yes, to reassure members here, the laboratory has adjusted well. Steve Lund has taken the reins and apparently is doing a superb job. Also, he immediately promoted one of the women researchers to be his deputy. So, it looks as if we have done a satisfactory job." "Wonderful," said Vera. "I think..." She stopped, surprised. There had been a knock at the door. She looked up, annoyed. When the knock came again, she sighed, went to the door and opened it. Facing her was a pretty, dark-haired young woman in a cream-colored skirted suit, a dark blue blouse, tan hose, and white shoes. The suit looked much too big and hung loosely on her. "Yes?" asked Vera. "Look, miss. We're in conference here. This is a private meeting. You're disturbing us." The woman peered round the door. "I just want to see all of you ladies. I'm glad I have you all together. You see, I want to thank you." "Thank us? What for?" "Something about a spell." Vera drew in her breath. "Please," the woman said. "I think I'd better come in. I'm sure that what I have to say is private too." Mystified, concerned, Vera ushered her in and quickly closed the door. The woman stood beside Vera and looked at the others. "My name, the one I am using now, is Kathy Jones. A month ago I was Kelvin Jones." She gave a mischievous grin round the table. "Yes, I'm quite bit different." Vera and the others watched her, warily. "Please, relax, but I gather that you have some way of changing men into women by some incantation. You see, I was working in the basement of the unit next door to the one you rented so briefly. I wondered what was going on. Something about the ductwork must have allowed me hear all you said, including that spell you read out. I heard it too, and, like that guy you used it on, I started to be transformed. I was lucky. I managed to track you down from that van and furniture you rented. It's nice to meet you all." Kathy's eyes twinkled at the shocked looks of the women. "Yes, I went unconscious too, but I must have woken earlier than whoever you were trying it on, and I managed to get to my apartment. My truck was parked opposite the unit." Vera got her tongue. Miss Jones. Look, we're very sorry. We will immediately make amends. We'd no wish to change your life. We have a spell that reverses the effect of that one. We will give you that and we will recompense you. But please, you must keep it absolutely secret. Kathy waved her hand in dismissal. Look, you've got it wrong. I want to thank you. What you did was the best thing ever happened to me. She blushed slightly. Actually, I had some women's clothing at home already, well, quite a bit. You see, I always felt I should be a woman. You did it for me. Now I feel great. Can you imagine, going from a heavy man such as I was, confused about his identity, to a woman like me? She twirled round. I'm slim, I'm svelte, I'm pretty. She smiled. The world is my oyster and I'm going to have fun. The committee members sank back into their chairs in relief. But if we can help you in any other way, stuttered Vera. You've already given me what I wanted most in the world. The only thing is, maybe, can I ask for a little financial help? I'll have to get an entirely new wardrobe. I've become quite a bit different in size. These clothes I'm wearing are the only ones from my UGG collection that didn't absolutely hang on me, and the fit's not great with these. I was over 200 pounds. Now look at me. She put her hands at her slim waist and slid them up to her bust. I was over 6 feet, now I'm at least 6 inches smaller. I used to be a duct and sheet metal worker and I don't want to do that anymore. I fancy a career change, maybe working with kids, and I could use some training for that. If you could help, it would be great. Maybe just one more thing too. I fully agree with what you're doing. It's wonderful. So, do you think I could join your committee?